Namaste and welcome to Daily News Simplified, the what, why, and how of newspaper reading. Now we would be analyzing the Delhi edition of the Hindu newspaper of 27th of June 2019, and the news that would be covered today is given on the screen, and the timestamp for the same is given in the description and the comment section given below. And so now with this, let us start with the first article. Now we have taken this lead editorial from the editorial page on page 10. Now, according to the author, the Indian government is going to undertake several important meetings in the later of this month, whereby the G20 summit is going to be held. And on the sidelines of the G20 summit, a meeting between Russia, India, China, which is the RIC trilateral, and a meeting between Japan, India, and Australia, which is the GIA trilateral, is also going to happen. Now, on the sidelines of the G20 summit, bilateral meetings between the Russian President Vladimir Putin and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, and also between the US President Donald Trump and the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi, is also going to happen. And apart from this, the Wuhan summit between the Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi and the Chinese President Xi Jinping is expected to happen in the October of this year. Now, according to the author, each of these upcoming meetings represent a fork in the road. Now, what this means is that basically there are two separate paths that India can undertake within these upcoming meetings, whereby the one path would lead India towards the United States and the other path would lead India towards Russia and China. Now, what has happened is that India up till now has been able to take a balanced approach between both the blocs, first being the US and its allies, and the second bloc being Russia and China. Now, this balanced approach India has been able to undertake based on India's policy of strategic autonomy, which is based upon multi-alignment. Now, what this basically means is that India will take its own foreign policy decision on any issue, and this decision would be based on India's national interest. And therefore, whichever bloc or country is able to help India in achieving its national interest, India will partner with that country on that issue. So, for an example, India is working with China in climate change talks against the climate change policy that has been undertaken by the United States and the developed countries. Similarly, India is working with the United States in the United Nations Security Council against China's earlier objection to declaring Masood Azhar as a global terrorist. Similarly, India is also working with China in trying to reform the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, and also in forming the Asian Investment Infrastructure Bank, or the AIIB, and the BRICS Bank, which is the New Development Bank. While similarly, India is also working with the United States in containing China's policy within the Indo-Pacific region. And therefore, what you can see from this is that India is taking a balanced approach between the United States and between Russia and China, whereby India is able to take its own foreign policy decisions on any issue such as climate change, multilateral banking, based upon India's own national interest. And up till now, India is able to align with any country or any bloc which has been able to provide help to India in achieving that particular issue of national interest. However, according to the author, this policy of India of strategic autonomy based on multi-alignment has now become unsustainable. Whereby this policy has become unsustainable first due to the rise in divide and the confrontation that is now ongoing between the United States and the Russia-China bloc. And secondly, this policy has become unsustainable because of the policies of Donald Trump, whereby the most recent example of this would be Iran. Now, China and Iran were the top two importers of Iranian oil in the world. However, what the United States did was that it imposed sanctions on Iran and demanded for each country, including China and India, to reduce their imports of Iranian oil to zero. However, what happens afterward was that China refused this US demand, but India indirectly agreed to this US demand. Now, what used to happen earlier was Iran was selling India oil cheaper than the international oil prices, which was good for the Indian economy. However, because of the US pressure, we had taken a decision of decreasing our import of Iranian oil that might not be within our best national interest. Similarly, Huawei, which is a Chinese company, provides the best and the cheapest technology infrastructure for the upcoming 5G network. However, one of the demands of the United States is that it does not want us to allow Huawei within India's 5G trials. Now again, not allowing the Huawei company as part of India's 5G trials would again might not be within our best national interest. Now, apart from this, there are several other examples of how it has become very difficult for India to take its own foreign policy decision on any issue based on India's own national interest, whether being Iran, Huawei, Venezuela, whereby on more and more issues the Donald Trump administration is forcing India to take its side, even though it might not be in our best national interest. Apart from this, the increase in the divide between the United States and the Russia China bloc has also largely affected India, whereby India wanted to import the S 400 missile system from Russia, but because of the rivalry between the United States and Russia, United States does not want India to import the S 400 missile system. And similarly is the example with Huawei. Because of the US China technology war, the US does not want India to have Huawei as part of its 5G trials. And therefore, because of the policies of the Donald Trump administration and the increase in divide between both the blocs, India's ability to take its own policy decision on international issues has become much more difficult. Now, according to the author, whether India's current policy of strategic autonomy based on multi-alignment becomes sustainable or not would be seen within these upcoming meetings, whereby India would be required to take a position on various international issues between the policies that are favored by the United States and between those policies which are favored by Russia and China. And it is within that regard that the author has highlighted various solutions that India can undertake so as to overcome these problems. Whereby the first thing that the author says that India requires substantial and clearly defined foreign policy objectives. Now, the first objective that the author is saying that India needs to pursue is that have the backing of our own neighbors such as Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, and others on various international issues. So, for an example, if India is against the Belt Road Initiative of China, then India must convince Sri Lanka, Nepal, and Bangladesh and other countries to support India's stand against the Belt Road Initiative. The second objective highlighted by the author is that India needs its own list of demands that it can ask from the big powers such as the United States and China. So for an example, it is an open secret that one of the main reasons why India supported the US demand to reduce the Iranian oil imports was because the US was going to support India in the United Nations Security Council in declaring Masood Azhar as a global terrorist. And apart from this, the United States is also going to help India in blacklisting Pakistan within the Financial Action Task Force. And it is within that context that the author is saying that India requires its own list of demands from major powers. And the third and the last objective which the author has said that India must avoid tactical transactionalism. Now what this means is that India shouldn't only focus on short-term give and take in terms of foreign policy objective with other countries. So let's say if you're negotiating with the United States, Canada, UK or France, do not only focus on getting more visas for Indians, which might be a very short-term objective. And according to the author, the India's foreign policy objectives needs to be defined with regards to long-term. Where an example of this is getting Masood Azhar being declared as a global terrorist or having Pakistan blacklisted within the Financial Action Task Force is one of the long-term objectives that India can and is able to achieve. Apart from this, what the author has also said is that for India to form long-term foreign policy objectives, India must follow the policy of non-alignment. Now, according to the author, following the policy of non-alignment does not mean that India has to go back to the non-alignment movement, which according to the author is a dead organization. But rather what the author is saying that India needs to fall back on the policy of non-alignment which India used to follow. Now, through the policy of non-alignment, India needs to democratize international relations. And it is by democratizing international relations that India can safeguard its own self-interest. Now these are the main points which have been highlighted by the author, which can act as a solution for India to overcome the current problem of having to choose a path between two confronting blocs, one led by the United States and second by Russia and China. And according to the author, through these solutions, India can safeguard its national interest in international relations. So now hopefully you've understood the main crux of this editorial, whereby you should see this editorial and the explanation given in this section from the perspective of GS Paper 2 within the section International Relations. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now I've taken this article from page 1. Now what this article has highlighted is that India has won the unanimous support of all the 55 countries which are member of the Asia Pacific Group in the United Nations, whereby all of these 55 countries within the group have supported India to become a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, whereby India is now going to become a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council from 2021 till 2022. Now, another important aspect is that both Pakistan and China, which are part of the 55 countries which are member of the Asia Pacific group, have also supported India's bid to become a non-permanent member. Now, what we're going to do is understand about the United Nations Security Council from the perspective of GS Paper 2 within the section International Relations, and within the subsection Important International Institution, which being the United Nations Security Council, whereby we're going to understand the structure and the mandate of the United Nations Security Council. Now, the most primary responsibility of the United Nations Security Council is for the maintenance of international peace and international security. And therefore, because it has this primary responsibility, the United Nations Security Council takes the lead in determining the existence of a threat to international peace and security, or whether some country has committed an act of aggression. So therefore, it is the responsibility of the United Nations Security Council which considered that Saddam Hussein had committed an act of aggression by invading Kuwait in 1991. But the United Nations Security Council did not consider that the United States, which when it attacked Iraq and Afghanistan, was an act of aggression. Similarly, when the United Kingdom, France and other countries attacked Libya, it was not considered as an act of aggression against Libya. Now, one of the main reasons as to why this is because the United Kingdom, France, United States, China and Russia are permanent members of the United Nations Security Council. So whatever action that they may undertake is generally not considered as an act of aggression because it is vetoed by the permanent members. Now, whenever the United Nations Security Council does consider that a country has committed an act of aggression, the first thing that it does is that it calls upon both the countries which are involved to settle the dispute in a peaceful manner. Whereby what the United Nations Security Council can also do is recommend terms of settlement. Whereby, let's say, if there has been a conflict between country A and B, that the United Nations Security Council can say that both countries A and B need to undertake step 1, step 2, step 3 so as to solve this dispute in a peaceful manner. However, if both the countries do continue with their act of aggression against international peace and security, then the United Nations Security Council can also impose sanctions, and after that, the United Nations Security Council can also authorize the use of force so as to maintain and restore international peace and security. Whereby, let's say currently, the United Nations Security Council has imposed sanctions on Iraq, Syria, North Korea, Iran, and among other countries. And one of the main examples of the use of force by the United Nations Security Council was against Iraq when it under Saddam Hussein invaded the country of Kuwait in 1991. Now, another important function of the United Nations Security Council is that it recommends to the United Nations General Assembly with regards to the appointment of the Secretary General of the United Nations. And apart from this, for the election of judges to the International Court of Justice, both the United Nations General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council vote separately to elect the judges. So I'll give you an example. Now, Dalveer Bhandari, who is an Indian, was elected as a judge to the International Court of Justice in 2017. Now, for the election of Dalveer Bhandari to the International Court of Justice, his appointment had to be passed by both the United Nations General Assembly separately and by the United Nations Security Council separately. And this is a procedure which is done for every judge's appointment within the International Court of Justice, whereby their appointment has to be passed both by the United Nations Security Council and the General Assembly. Now, the fourth main power of the United Nations Security Council is that it can establish subsidiary organs which it deems necessary for the performance of its own functions. Now, one of the most important subsidiary organ which was recently in the news was of the United Nations Security Council Sanctions Committee, whereby it was the Sanctions Committee 1267 which had declared Masood Azhar as a global terrorist. Now, if you want to further understand about the United Nations Sanctions Committee, you can follow the Daily News Simplified video of 15th of March. And similarly, if you want to further understand about the ISIL and Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, or what is more popularly known as the United Nations 1267 Committee, which had blacklisted Masood Azhar, you can also follow the Daily News Simplified video of 15th of March. Now, an important power of the United Nations Security Council is that the decisions which have been passed by the United Nations Security Council are obligated to be implemented by the UN members. Where a recent example of this is that the United Nations General Assembly passed a resolution which had said that the United Kingdom must give back the Chagos archipelago back to Mauritius. However, what you need to understand is that the resolution passed by the United Nations General Assembly are not obligated to be implemented, whereby they are only recommendations in nature. But whatever decision which has been passed by the United Nations Security Council has to be followed by all the UN members. So let's say if it had been the United Nations Security Council which had asked UK to give back the Chagos archipelago to Mauritius, then UK would need to follow this decision. Now this is an important power that makes the United Nations Security Council more important and significant as compared to the other organs of the United Nations, whereby the decisions given by other organs are only recommendations, while the decisions given out by United Nations Security Council are obligated to be implemented by the UN members. So now hopefully up till here you've understood the functions and powers of the United Nations Security Council. Now let us understand the structure and basically the composition of the UN Security Council. Now Article 23 of the United Nations Charter says that the United Nations Security Council would consist of 15 members. Now these 15 members also have to be members of the United Nations itself. Now the 5 permanent members which has been given under Article 23 of the UN Charter includes the Republic of China, France, the USSR, the United Kingdom and the United States. Now we'll come back to the reason as to why it says Republic of China and the Soviet Union under Article 23 and why it has not been changed to the People's Republic of China and Russia. Now it is the responsibility of the United Nations General Assembly to elect 10 other non-permanent members of the United Nations, whereby this election by the United Nations General Assembly for the non-permanent member would be based on 2 main criteria. The first criteria is the contribution of that member to the maintenance of international peace and security, and the second criteria being of equitable geographical distribution. So an example of this is that countries such as India, Indonesia, Brazil and others have been elected as non-permanent members of the United Nations Security Council on multiple occasions. However, countries such as Bhutan, Afghanistan or smaller island countries such as Maldives and Fiji have not been elected ever as non-permanent members of the UN Security Council, whereby these smaller countries cannot strongly contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security. Apart from this, there are several countries such as Israel who can contribute to the maintenance of international peace and security but have never been elected as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council. And one of the reasons this is because the non-permanent members are elected by the UN General Assembly, and several countries, especially within the Arab world, which are part of the Asia Pacific group, would not support the bid of Israel to become a non-permanent member. Now the geographical distribution of the non-permanent members is that 5 seats would be shared by the African and Asian states, 1 seat by the Eastern European state, 2 seats for Latin America and the Caribbean states, and 2 seats for Western Europe and other states. Apart from this, what you should also know is that a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council would be elected for a term of 2 years, and a retiring member shall not be eligible for immediate re-election. So let's say in 2021, when India retires as being a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, then it cannot go again for an election for the 2022-23 batch. And apart from this, what you should also know is that election for 5 non-permanent members of the UN Security Council is held every year. Now the last aspect that you need to understand with regards to the composition of UN Security Council is that according to Article 108 of the United Nations Charter, the UN Charter can only be amended by a decision taken by the United Nations General Assembly which has been approved and ratified by at least 2/3 of its membership, whereby apart from this, this decision has to be approved and ratified by each of the permanent member of the UN Security Council. Now, Article 108 is very important to understand with regards to reforms of the United Nations Security Council. Now, as you already understand, India is trying to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Now, for India to become a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council, then Article 23 of the United Nations Charter, which lists the permanent members of the UN Security Council, would be needed to be amended. Now, to amend Article 23 of the UN Charter, this decision to make India a permanent member of the United Nations Security Council would require to be approved and ratified by two-thirds of the members of the United Nations General Assembly. And apart from this decision to make India a permanent member of UN Security Council would require to be approved by each of the permanent members, that being the United States, Russia, France, UK and China. And it is only after that can Article 23 of the UN Charter can be amended and India can be added as being a permanent member. Now to undergo this procedure is extremely difficult within the United Nations. Now what happened was that in 1950s, the Mao Zedong's People's Liberation Army overtook China and they changed the name of the country to People's Republic of China. And similarly, as you already understand, in 1991, the USSR broke up. And after that, Russia got the permanent seat of the United Nations Security Council. And similarly, before 1950, the permanent seat of the United Nations Security Council was given to Republic of China, which is now Taiwan. But after 1950, this seat went to the People's Republic of China, which is today's mainland China. Now to change the name from USSR to Russia or from Republic of China to People's Republic of China would require an amendment within Article 23. But the United Nations members are not even able to pass this resolution to simply change the name from USSR to Russia and from Republic of China to People's Republic of China, whereby Article 23 of the UN Charter even till today contains the name USSR and Republic of China as permanent members. And only from this you can also understand as to why it would be so difficult for India to get the United Nations to amend Article 23. So now hopefully with this you have also understood both the aspects about the United Nations Security Council from the perspective of your GS Paper 2 within the section Important International Institution, their structure and mandate. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 15. Now what has happened is that the Reserve Bank of India has decided to monitor the financial health of housing finance companies, whereby the Reserve Bank of India is going to monitor the financial health of HFCs on a daily basis. Now the housing finance companies are a category of non-banking finance companies or NBFCs, whereby the housing finance companies specialize in lending loans for the housing sector. Now there might be some housing finance companies which you might have heard of, such as DHFL, Bajaj Housing, Capital First, among others, whereby such companies specialize in lending loan to the housing sector, which mainly includes the developers of real estate. Now apart from this, what you should also know is that since housing finance companies are a category of non-banking finance companies or NBFCs, they are regulated by the National Housing Bank. Now one of the main reasons as to why RBI is going to monitor the financial health of the housing finance companies is because what has happened is that the housing finance companies have mainly relied on short-term borrowings, especially through commercial papers. Now in simple terms, commercial papers are unsecured debt instruments which are issued basically by companies. Now what a company would do is that they would issue a commercial paper that they require this much amount of money. And let's say they would provide an interest of 6% on borrowing this money. And therefore through a commercial paper, a company or corporation are able to borrow money from the market. And therefore the housing finance companies have mainly relied on short borrowings, especially through commercial papers. However, what this has done is that it has led to concerns over asset liability mismatch. Now because there have been concerns over asset liability mismatch for housing finance companies, banks are now not willing to give loans to housing finance companies. Now commercial banks within India are one of the biggest financiers of housing finance companies. So now what is happening is that the commercial banks within India are giving a loan to housing finance companies, and then the housing finance companies are giving a loan to real estate sector companies. But because the real estate sector within India is in a financial distress, the real estate sector companies are not able to pay back the interest and the principal amount on the loan that they have taken from the housing finance companies. And therefore the loans which these real estate companies have undertaken becomes a non-performing asset for the housing finance companies. Now since housing finance companies are not able to earn money in terms of interest or the principal amount from the real estate companies, they themselves are then not able to pay back the interest or the principal amount from the money which they have borrowed from commercial banks within India. And therefore there is a strong chance that the loans which the housing finance companies have undertaken might become a non-performing assets for commercial banks within India. And this has become one of the major reasons as to why commercial banks within India are not providing loans to housing finance companies. Now, it is within this context that the Reserve Bank of India has ensured that there should not be any further escalation within the crisis with regards to housing finance companies. Now, to prevent a financial crisis occurring from housing finance companies and this crisis then spreading to other segments of the financial sector, the Reserve Bank of India is going to monitor the liquidity situation, asset liability gap, and the repayment schedules of the housing finance companies on a daily basis. Now, these are the main points that you needed to understand from this article. And so, now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now, we have taken this article from page 7. Now, the focus of this article is quite small. Now, what has recently happened is that the Quality Council of India executed a survey based on the Smart Police concept. Now, the Smart Police survey is based on certain parameters which was given by Prime Minister Narendra Modi, whereby according to Prime Minister Narendra Modi, Smart Police Force is one which is both strict and sensible, modern and mobile, alert and accountable, reliable and responsive, and techno-savvy and trained. Now, based on these qualities that police should have, the Quality Council of India formed various parameters such as performance in controlling crime, infrastructure, police building, mess, optimal use of technology, citizen feedback, and various other parameters to conduct what was called the Smart Police Survey. However, this is what is required to understand from this article about the survey itself. Apart from this, what you should understand is about the Quality Council of India. Now, the Quality Council of India is an autonomous body which is under the Department of Industrial Policy and Promotion, which is under the Ministry of Commerce. Now, this Quality Council of India has been jointly created by the Confederation of Indian Industry or the CII, the Federation of Indian Chambers of Commerce and Industry or FICCI, and the Associated Chambers of Commerce and Industry or ASCOM. Now, apart from this, the main objectives of the Quality Council of India is first to establish and operate national accreditation structure, and secondly, to monitor and administer the National Quality Campaign. Now, an example of this is that there are several boards under the Quality Council of India, whereby the National Accreditation Board for Education and Training runs accreditation of schools. Similarly, the National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Healthcare Providers runs accreditation for hospitals, nursing homes, blood banks, primary healthcare centers, whereby accreditation basically means that this particular institution is performing a particular task based on the set parameters. Whereby, let's say for example, the National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Healthcare Providers has certain number of parameters for blood banks. So if there is a blood bank which has followed all of these parameters, then they could get an accreditation from the National Accreditation Board for Hospitals and Healthcare Providers, which would then formally recognize this institution as a properly functioning blood bank. Now you should see both the Smart Police Survey and the Quality Council of India from the perspective of GS Paper 2 within the section Governance. And so now with this, let us move on to the next article. Now we have taken this article from page 9. Now what is required to be understood from this article is given in the article itself, whereby what has happened is that the Government of India has rolled out a Jal Shakti campaign. Now the main aim of the Jal Shakti Abhiyan or the Jal Shakti campaign is first ensuring water conservation, second ensuring the promotion of irrigation efficiency, and the third objective is to ensure a public campaign so as to achieve both the first objectives. First is ensuring water conservation and secondly the promotion of irrigation efficiency. Now this Jal Shakti Abhiyan is mainly focused upon rural India. Now as you already might be aware of, water is basically part of the state list under Schedule 7. However, this Jal Shakti campaign would be led by the central government, whereby it would be coordinated by central IAS officer. However, it would have officials from the state and the district level working with the central IAS officers. Now this Jal Shakti campaign would first be run from 1st of July till September of 15 in only those states which receive rainfall during the southwest monsoon, while the states which receive the rainfall during the retreating or the northeast monsoon would be covered from 1st of October to 30th November. Now apart from this, the Jal Shakti Abhiyan or the Jal Shakti campaign would aim to accelerate water conservation activities which are first being carried out under the Manrega scheme and also under the Integrated Watershed Management Program of the Rural Development Ministry. Similarly, it would also ensure water conservation activities which are being undertaken by the Jal Shakti Ministry and the Environment Ministry. Now, these water conservation activities would include rainwater harvesting, renovation of water bodies, renovation of borewell recharge structures, watershed development, and intensive afforestation, whereby the progress for all of these activities would be monitored in real time. Now, these are the main facts that you needed to understand about the Jal Shakti Abhiyan or the Jal Shakti campaign. Now, you should see this Jal Shakti Abhiyan from the perspective of GS Paper 3 within the section Environment and within the subsection Conservation. But hopefully, with this, you have gotten the basic facts that you needed to understand about the Jal Shakti Abhiyan. And so, now with this, let us move on to the next section. Now there are two questions for practice, and what you need to do is pause this video, solve both of these questions, and wait for 5 seconds for the correct answer. Now the correct answer to question number 1 is A, 1 and 2, whereby the National Housing Bank is a statutory organization which is wholly owned by the Reserve Bank of India. Apart from this, the National Housing Bank does lend directly for housing projects which are undertaken by public housing agencies. However, statement number 3 is wrong, whereby National Housing Bank does not grant home loans directly to individuals. Now, with regards to question number 2, the correct answer is B, 2 only. Now, as you already understand, national housing companies are a form of NBFC or non-banking finance company. And as you must know, non-banking finance companies cannot accept demand deposit, they cannot issue check drawn on themselves, and also they do not form any part of the payment and settlement system. And therefore it is only statement number 2 which is correct. Now there are 2 more questions for your practice, and as you already understand, pause this video, solve both of these questions, and wait for 5 seconds for the correct answer. Now the correct answer to question number 3 is B, 2, 3 and 4. Now the question asks which of the statements given above are incorrect. Now the United Nations Security Council does have the power to make decisions which are obligated to be implemented by all UN member states. Now statement number 2 is incorrect, whereby the United Nations Security Council appoints the judges of the International Court of Justice, not the International Criminal Court. Apart from this, the UN Security Council is not bound by the recommendations of the UN General Assembly. And with regards to statement number 4, the composition of the UN Security Council has changed from the time of its inception, whereby earlier there used to be 6 non-permanent members, which has now been increased to 10. Now with regards to question number 4, the correct answer is D, neither 1 nor 2. Now it is the Bureau of Standards of India or BES, which is the national standards body of India, while it is the Quality Council of India or QCI, which is the Accreditation Authority of India. Apart from this, the Quality Council of India does not directly receive any consumer complaints with regards to quality problems, and therefore both these statements are incorrect. And now with this we come to an end in the analysis of today's newspaper. Now we move on to the question for today.